Thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. My name is Johnny, and I'm from Opus Independence, the not-for-profit worker-owned social enterprise that runs the Festival of Debate. Festival programme this year started on the 16th of April and runs through to the 25th of May and includes over 65 events, 150 speakers and 50 partners. The festival aims to explore the entangled ecological, economic and political crises we collectively face. There are no easy answers, but we hope the festival creates a space to explore and hold complexity and uncertainty and brings together a community of people to make change where they are. Most of our events are free at the point of access. Where we do need to charge, we keep ticket prices as low as possible. If you are in a position to do so and you would like to make a donation to support the festival, you can do that at festivalofdebate.com, which is where you probably secured your ticket, but I can also drop a link into the chat. We want to tell different kinds of stories at the festival this year about the societal challenges and big opportunities for positive change we're seeing through these events. You will get an email when this event has finished. If you could take a moment to fill that in, it is very much the source of how we shape the festival going forward. And your contributions are not only appreciated, but do actually have an effect on what the festival looks like in the future. Couple of housekeeping things and formatting. Obviously, we are online today, so if you do hear a fire alarm, I would check it immediately because it's probably in your house or wherever you're dialing in from and needs attention. We're going to run for about 90 minutes today, so both Ray and Ed will take 20 minutes each to sort of do some introductory remarks and explain some of their perspectives. And then I've got a couple of questions to ask them, but then we will open it up to the floor and yourselves for questions. So it is a great pleasure to have both Ray and Ed joining us today. So thank you both for taking the time. We are going to have a discussion and some interesting insights around system thinking. As you will all be well aware from the title of the talk that you signed up to today. So we're going to be exploring how we tackle climate change using systems thinking. And I am going to hand over to Ray to kick us off. And I will also share his slides as well. So Ray, over to you.
Thanks very much, Johnny. Good day to everyone. Greetings from Florianópolis in Brazil, where I'm speaking with you today. And Johnny, I just noticed that sometimes the Zoom cracks up a bit. If for some reason the distance and distortions get too big, please feel free to sort of cut me and hand over to Ed, my co-author, colleague and friend, who is performing with me on this. Our invitation today, I think, rests on the book we wrote together in 2020, The Hidden Power of Systems Thinking, Governance in a Climate Emergency, which is Ed is showing everyone there, available from Routledge if you're interested. The good news for 2024 is that the book is being published in France, and so a French audience will be exposed to it as well. So that's enough of the sell. My background is that I'm a Professor Emeritus in Systems at the Open University. I've been at the Open University for over 30 years, and we've been educating systems thinking and systems thinking practitioners at the OU for over 50 years. So we've got quite a lot of background, skill and capability there in doing this. And I'm going to draw on some of that as I do in my book and in the conversation today. But I'm Australian by birth, and a lot of my life has been spent at working with the breakdown between humans and the biosphere. I started working in biology, plant ecophysiology, but grew up in a farming community, and it seemed to me that many agriculturalists fail to incorporate human dimensions and sacrifice the biophysical at the expense of the human. And experiences in Indonesia and Africa and other ones convinced me that our models of development, rural development, were failing, not so much because of local people, but because of the mental models we in the West imposed on them. And I guess you could say that I've spent 30 years trying to show that the mental models we've developed about ourselves as humans and about our own models of practice and action in the West are totally inadequate to our circumstances. So to pick up on one of the themes that Philip has raised in his questions, I started out thinking that one had to engage with participatory development, and it involved local people in the participation and innovation processes around research and development. But after a while, I learned that participation was absolutely necessary, but never sufficient. And we moved on to an area called social learning, which I might explain about a bit in a minute. And social learning, we did a lot of work in Europe, many case studies, and showed how we could get social learning to function, how it could act as both a participatory process as well as a governance mechanism. But even it was both necessary but never sufficient. And in more recent years, I've been focused on the inadequacies of our institutional arrangements, i.e. the norms and rules we humans have invented for ourselves, and our governance arrangements. And unless you get institutional arrangements and governance arrangements in place, then the sort of aspirations that this community holds and that I hold and many others hold will never, ever take hold. And so I thought with that, Johnny, perhaps we just might start with the first slide. I'm in Florianopolis, which is the second most southerly state in Brazil, but just in the state below me. You may have read about it, but you may have missed it as well. In the state of Rio Grande do Sul, they have just had massive floods and rainfall, $4 billion plus worth of economic damage, over 500,000 people displaced from their homes, floods that have just not gone away, water not receding. This is the capital city, Rio Grande, Porto Alegre. And so this particular event is actually the second event in a couple of years of a similar nature, although far more severe. Rainfall of up to 13 inches in a short space of time. And it typifies to me the sort of phenomena that climate change is bringing all around different parts of the world. It may not yet have happened in Yorkshire, or it may have happened in the form that Yorkshire will have it. And the point I want to make is that if one engages or thinks about an event like this, of which there are many and there will be more, then it brings together issues to do with climate change. It brings out issues of planning failure and future planning directions, the idea of urban resilience and what that constitutes. If you understand the history of this situation, it reflects on how neoliberalism has influenced the governance of that state, and how that, in the face of neoliberalism, a lot of planning laws and legislation has been rescinded and done away with. And perhaps more recently and more insidiously, in its current manifestation, it exemplifies how fake news is being constantly cultivated and perpetuated to create a division in an already divided society between Bolsonaro supporters and Lula supporters in the politics of Brazil. Now, you can interpret some of those things in the context of Yorkshire and the UK and say, well, these are things that apply here, or you may not think they do, but I suspect that they do apply, and they relate to agricultural policy, landscape protection and landscape understanding, ignoring ecological processes, cities built on river, swamp, drainage systems without sufficient capability or capacity to respond to what climate change is going to bring towards us. So this is a massive systemic problem confronting us all. Next slide, please. Now, many of you will understand the global cycles that are important in the functioning of the biosphere: water cycle, carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle, and oxygen cycle. Well, the concept of the Anthropocene, even though the Earth scientists have not decided to use it, is nonetheless established that we humans are changing the whole nature of life on Earth. And we do this by the massive disruptions we are creating to all of these particular global cycles. And climate change is most manifest in our disruptions to the carbon cycle and the water cycle. But these not only as they intersect with each other, and as we know with the nitrates directive in Europe, we've disrupted through agriculture nitrate cycling and nitrate efflux and nitrate pollution in the bathing waters issues and directives in the UK, and river qualities, etc. So whatever we attempt to do has to address these broader systemic phenomena that constitute life on Earth. Next slide. Now, if you think about what's going on in Rio Grande do Sul here in Brazil, I mean, what is manifest is the way in which climate change, whether it's through water or temperature, is becoming manifest, and why I despair at a discourse that talks in terms of mean or average temperatures. The phenomena we are going to experience is to do with extremes, and it's going to be the nature of the extreme, the duration of the extreme, that is going to determine how we humans are able to act and tolerate what is going on. So this slide, which comes from our book, is making the point that it's the tails of the distribution, either temperature or rainfall or other phenomena, that are the key variables that we've got to keep our head around and be prepared to be able to respond to. And without that, we're going to have disaster after disaster, crisis after crisis, etc. Next slide, please. This is yet one example of how extremes operate. In Melbourne in 2009, the Black Saturday bushfires, temperatures reached 45.5 degrees centigrade, and this is what happened to the train lines because of the temperature tolerance of the steel. Now, when I talk about extremes, these extremes, or what we have regarded in the past as upper level tolerances, have been built into all of our building codes, our designs of sewage systems, our designs of water distribution systems. So whenever an extreme is exceeded beyond those historical tolerances, then something breaks down. And this is yet one example of that, but there are going to be many, many more. Next slide, please. So the crisis in Rio Grande do Sul is a crisis manifest in the relationship between humans and the biosphere, or the environment, if you want to call it that. But there are other types of systemic failings and crises that are manifest perhaps totally within the human social system. And on my way here, and the way on the same flight a week later, my wife, we got stuck and missed our connections in Sao Paulo, had all those terrible traffic problems and issues and everything. As this note says, this airport in Sao Paulo is crowded and irksome at best and sheer transportation hell at worst. So we humans have invented these particular processes and systems, if you like, to pursue our social purpose. Now, I can get very angry at what happened to me in Sao Paulo and missing my flight, and having to stay overnight, all those sorts of things, and being very tired. But it begs the question, what is the social purpose? And how do we begin to appreciate social purpose? Unless we're in conversation or dialogue, is the social purpose of Sao Paulo's airport to pursue economic gain for traders who inhabit the airport? Is it to mollify unions who are unloading the planes and cause our baggage to be delayed by 2.5 hours getting off the plane? Or is it to maintain viability of LATAM, the airline that dominates South America? Or is it to get passengers to a safe destination in a reasonable amount of time? So the whole question of purpose becomes questionable, and the only way you can begin to establish whether a system is functioning is to have a conversation about purpose. Because without purpose, the system can't be said to exist. It's just a mess of interactions. And so I think what we're talking about today is, what are the purposeful actions you as a group or we as individuals can engage with others who draw on different perspectives, who will have different purposes in mind, and how can we negotiate or reach accommodations between differences as to then be able to embark on a common purpose. And this requires social interaction, or what I would call social learning, to happen. Next slide, please. Now, historically, we have failed to really deal well with social purpose, because many of the situations we find ourselves in are what Rittel and Weber many years ago described as wicked problems. There are other terms to describe these types of situations, but this particular document was written in 2007 by the Australian Public Service Commission and pointed out that Australian policy was failing consistently because it failed to engage with situations as if they were wicked problems, and that public policy was failing consistently as a result. And these were just some of the advantages. But of course, response to climate change is, if you like, the supra-wicked problem, or the wicked problem in these regard. And perhaps the really big wicked problem is not so much climate change, but is our capacity to take it on board and respond meaningfully in the time that is required to avoid the sorts of disasters that are going to unfold. Next slide. So one of the questions I'm sure you're discussing in the festival is, how can we think and act in relation to our current circumstances? What purposeful action will aid human flourishing, create and sustain a viable space for humanity and I frame it in terms of our ongoing co-evolution with the Anthropocene biosphere, i.e. that is that biosphere that we humans are creating through our own actions. And this human-created Anthropocene biosphere is essentially new to human history. We are having to take responsibility for our actions. And this is how co-evolution works. Imagine you yourself going for a walk. Well, walking as a practice arises in the relational dynamics between you, an embodied you, and a situated you, with a context, a medium. It could be the floor, it could be a footpath, it could be a walking track in Yorkshire. But the walking arises in the relational dynamics between two entities, you and a medium such as the floor. And I would contend in posing this framing that this is a good way to think about how we respond to climate change, because we have got to continue walking on the earth, and it's our relationship with the earth that is the crucial issue of our futures. And at the moment, the quality of our walking and the direction of our walking is not good enough. And it's not good enough because many of the historical institutions and governance arrangements we invented are taking us in the wrong direction. If you take this metaphor, it's the quality of the shoes and the style of the shoes that we are wearing that is undermining the capability and quality of our walking into the future. Next slide, please.
Yep, and that's also 50 minutes, 5 minutes to go.
Good, thanks. At the Open University, in the recent programs we've been developing, we've tried to be responsible about articulating our theory of change. If we're trying to invite students into thinking and acting systemically, then how are we imagining that thinking systemically will lead to change? And the first part of our theory of change is to look outward and say, well, we need to look out to the biosphere and make our relationship with the biosphere absolutely central to all that we do. But we also need to acknowledge that our relationship with the biosphere is mediated by what some now call the technosphere. The technosphere is that part of the earth in which we humans have deposited stuff in biomass terms, even greater than the earth itself has deposited. So this is all the cement and concrete and bitumen and wood and debris and pollution and other things that we humans have added to the surface of the earth, including technology, machines, and other types of invention. So this technosphere and our engagement with technology is really a critical issue about mediating our relationship with the biosphere in an ongoing future. So that's looking outward. But we also, we contend in our theory of change, have to look inward. And we have to look at us as a species and think about our evolutionary past. And we make the claim, based on learning from our experience, that we humans are born with systemic sensibilities, that we as mammals are born into relationship. One can think of the mother-child relationship, the child-child relationship, the child-father relationship, playing mammals, the processes by which young humans come into language, through how language develops in the young human. These are all systemic relational dynamics. And these are profound in the early years of the young human. But with our institutional arrangements and cultural arrangements, we make many of these relationships and relational dynamics, we move from being systemic to systematic. And that is, we move from a recursive, circular, relational set of actions to a simple cause and effect, linear idea of how we exchange and engage with the world. And so we design our modules at the Open University to try and reclaim or regain our systemic sensibilities, to engage with a whole plethora of scholarship that is subjugated and not apparent in any curricula of note of systems literacy, and to take our sensibility and literacy and to put it into action through systems thinking and practice capability. So that's how do you use it in the real world situations to try and affect change and transformation. And I'll just have one last slide and I'll stop there. If you're going to have a theory of change, you've got to have an idea of what it is to be human and how we humans engage in practice. And most of our students, when you ask them to think about thinking and acting and being engaged in practice, they find it very hard to locate themselves as central to their own practice. All the practice we humans do has to have a practitioner, an embodied and situation person who does the practice. Otherwise, practice doesn't happen. But we can stand out of our situatedness and reflect on how we do what we do when we do what we do. And one way of thinking about this systemically is to see the systemic relationships between a practitioner, you and your history or tradition of understanding out of which you think and act, the way in which you have enculturated theories or frameworks, or how you may choose frameworks to engage with situations, how you use methods, tools, techniques, etc., to do something about those situations, whether it's from cost-benefit analysis to scenario planning, etc., and how you act in the situations to change or transform them for the better. And finally, you can learn about how all of these things work together in what I call a practice performance. And one of the great failings of our societies today is that so many practice performances are not the sort of play you would pay to go and see. And I'll stop on that point.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ray. That's a really good way to get us all starting to think about these sort of things. So really appreciate that. Ed, I will bring you in now and reset the clock. So I'll give you a shout with 5 minutes to go again. And whatever point you would like to share your slides, just let me know.
Okay. Well, I'll continue from that into trying to understand what are these systems that are ruling us. And I've been doing a talk on what's stopping us stopping climate change. And the simple answer is the Constitution. And yeah, if you bring up the first slide, please, Johnny, and I'll try and explain or justify or make the case as to why, yeah, it's constitutions that are killing us. Or indeed, you can put it the other way around, how we could sort constitutions out to stop killing us, if you like. So any luck with, here we go. Brilliant. Right. So interestingly, I was in hospital a little while ago and I was getting prepped by various people, and I said to, the surgeon was engaging me in conversation, and I said, you know, I'm doing this talk, what's stopping us stopping climate change? And she just came back quick as a flash. It's money, isn't it? So here is the money system. And if we take at the center there, the global monetary system, this is the thing where shares and companies are bought and sold and traded. And essentially that system has drawn in, I mean, it's colonized. It's a fantastic colonizing system. It's colonized, initially obviously started in the US, but then it spread its wings with global finance, essentially mobile, global labor mobile, and so on, its ability to stretch across the world. So it will gobble up anything that moves, anything that it can possibly monetize. So, I mean, if it's the water supply in Africa, great, we'll have the water supply in Ghana or wherever it might be. Even at this moment, National Trust, which an organisation with which some of you'll be familiar, there's a sort of entryism thing, which is echoes of Militant and its entryism into the Labour Party into the 80s, Derek Hatton and the like. Anyway, it's trying to take over the National Trust by getting its members on, by getting people elected onto its council. And at some point, you could see the destination is, oh, yes, we'll float that on the stock exchange. So it's got an insatiable appetite. It runs according to the precepts of neoliberal economics, which Ray has mentioned. Neoliberal economics has come out of conventional economics, but it's important to stress that this is the system that absolutely puts the making of money at the top of everything. The social side, the human side, and most obviously the natural world side does not count. So in companies, you will find, on the one hand, I mean, all sorts of good people. I mean, many of us, I'm sure, today have worked or work in companies and are doing good work. But at the end of the day, that company is there to make money. If it doesn't make money, then you as management will get the boot. You as management will be engaged or co-opted, in effect, through bonus schemes to ensure that all of that happens. You've then got the situation where the companies have become very adept at preferential lobbying. Many people, I think, these days assume that it's the norm. It's quite normal for companies to, in effect, control government, which is what you do through preferential lobbying. Ray, particularly, and I have been engaged in trying to persuade the Australian Commission that has been set up to examine lobbying over there. It has come up and said, oh, we need a bigger register of lobbyists, which is by and large all these things do come up with. There are 8 conditions in a constitution that can lead to, that enable or allow preferential lobbying, starting principally with the lack of feedback, with lobbying in private, with the absence, if you do have an absence of proportional representation, with allowing money into politics and to control politics and so on. All of those are things which should be sorted out in a constitution, and then you can, in effect, control and prevent preferential lobbying. So it's not a norm. It means that people lose out in their interests in relation to the balance between companies, corporations, and the state. But as it stands today, preferential lobbying, that means that it has companies and the markets, in effect, have an arm lock over government. In some cases, that arm lock is so strong that you get state capture. So the coal industry in South Africa is a very good example, but don't think this doesn't happen here. You may remember the issue over of manipulating diesel emissions by the German car industry. That came to a halt, not because of anything the EU did, even though the EU knew about it. It came to a halt because of the US authorities, which obviously had a corporate interest in stopping this, but they stepped in. You then look at the way the EU works, and you'll find that actually German manufacturing, the most powerful part of the EU economy and the most powerful lobby in the EU economy, has a pretty strong influence on what the EU does and doesn't do. Down the other side, companies, we've got this mass advertising thing that goes on, you know, push, 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 buy, buy, buy. And in effect, that has enabled this arm lock over consumers. People go off and buy, buy, buy. And that, I think, has turned consumers into being farmed for profit. I mean, that's my experience often. And indeed, it's almost allowed. I mean, companies these days can do almost anything to extract money from you. I mean, wouldn't you regard it as illegal to find that you bought something unwittingly? But no, that's okay. Now, in this whole system, the important thing is that the environment doesn't matter. So in conventional economics, it doesn't count. It's whatever the word is. I can't think of the word now. It doesn't matter. But
externality.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ray. It's an externality. I mean, isn't economics wonderful? You know, this huge thing on which we depend, I will just put that to one side. And it means that we can regard the environment as an infinite resource and an infinite dumping ground. And hey ho. And next slide, please, Johnny. But actually, around the context for this whole system is the biosphere, nature, the natural world, whatever you want to call it, that says actually there are constraints on the way in which the money system behaves. The elites, of course, have worked this out. They've got their escape pods ready to go to bunkers in New Zealand, to go to Mars, or indeed to go to the metaverse. So that's where they're going, but the rest of us have to stay. So, you know, climate chaos, biodiversity loss, floods, wildfires, etc., etc. It doesn't work. We have to put this system within the context of nature. So next slide, please, Johnny. And we have to think what matters most. And then we have to reconstruct the way in which the constitutions operate, and indeed the way in which we operate according to what should matter most. So currently, I mean, you can argue as to my ranking of what seems to matter most in people's minds. You've got the global monetary system, neoliberal economics, and preferential lobbying. Some people at this point nail capitalism as being the problem, and I completely with that, but it's worth bearing in mind there are 50 shades of capitalism, and the kind we've got is the worst and most abusive. Put that to one side for the minute. Then we've got consumption and advertising. It's very interesting the way in which individualism has been promoted over the last 20 or 30 years. And, well, there is a conspiracy in all of this. But to what extent was that deliberate? Because individualism feeds the global monetary system and the behavior of people as being farmed for profit. But it also leads to zero responsibility. No, I can't do anything. You do it, please, and off you go. Public services, I put here. You've got party politics as a fail-safe. I mean, we've got an election coming up in the UK, and jolly good, there's going to be a change in government. But how much difference is this going to make fundamentally to everything that's going on? Culture wars are fairly prevalent. I think they are partially a product of people's inability to have any influence over the rest of this thing. You know, in terms of how much democracy do we have? Well, actually not very much. What can I actually do? Well, maybe I can do something socially. I think, again, they are there's all sorts of things to be said there, but generally they're a diversion from what we need to do. And the environment down the bottom there. So next slide, please, Johnny. So what has to matter most? Well, I mean, you know, to describe this slide as the bleeding obvious, as my mum would say, well, the biosphere, the natural world, has to come at the top, at the centre of every governance model in the world. That then has to go into the constitution, and from that is how all sorts of things operate. What does company law look like? What does property law look like? What does every other law look like? And regulation look like, and effective regulation. So that goes at the centre. We've then got a massive depollution and cleanup operation to do. And I think if we get it into our heads that that's where we're going, and we really understand, yeah, that's what we need to do, then I think this whole process becomes a positive process. Because at the minute, for me, the way it feels is we're just in this dreadful decline as the world, the economic world, sort of chunters on like mad. Meantime, the foundations of the natural world on which we stand are getting frittered away. But if we turn that round and say, okay, yeah, we're going to do this, then I think that there's some real release of energy. Fairly obviously, if we're going to do that, this is a collective act. You know, nature is a collective act. You can't have rampant individualism. We have to work together. If we're going to work together, then we have to engage people in how we're going to work together. What do you think? So the whole questions of participation, engagement, deliberation are ways in which people can understand what it is that needs to be done, why it has to be done, how we're going to do it, and actually then feel committed to what it is that is going to happen. And again, that has to be built into the constitution. The French recent year or two ago now had a big, properly run program of deliberation. Lots of citizens' assemblies, which are part of deliberation, operating over, I think it was 7 weekends. I mean, a lot of time and effort put in. They came up with 149 recommendations, proposals. They went to government, and government has put in or proposed to put into law 15 of them. So in other words, there was a 10% result and a 90% failure in effect, because there is no requirement in the French constitution that those citizens' assemblies, that process of deliberation, has to be acted upon, rather than, oh, that's terribly interesting. I mean, as here, oh, you know, how nice. And now we, the representative part of democracy, will get on and decide. And you can see a very clear dividing line in governments where people who have taken up this representative model, which is by and large what we have these days, and get into power, and they feel that we know, you know, they know what's best. They're going to take decisions. Sometimes it's the psychopathologies of them there. You know, we see it in the narcissism, and we see it in the control needs. And they're unable to make that leap to understand that participation, engagement, deliberation isn't about weakness. It's actually about strength. It's actually about getting to much better decisions. And of course, through civil society. And I think there's a question later on about civil society, but everything we're doing locally. We need to decide how to use land. and I don't mean, you know, what's going to happen to your garden, but land is a finite resource. And currently, the way in which land is used is up to the market. And that doesn't work in a world in the situation we now are. So that has to be thought about quite carefully. We need, fairly obviously, good government. And I've talked before, and we've talked before, and had sessions on what does good government mean. Good government, I think, starts with consideration of the question, can the world run on lies? And it's like, well, don't be stupid, Ed. Of course it can't run on lies, but it is actually running on lies now. So we've got the straight lies, you know, politicians, the media, and whoever else. We've got the lies inherent in preferential lobbying because it's always a partial view that's put forward. It's always trying to bounce government into situations. And I mean, if you ever hear, or I mean, please don't, but if you ever read something coming out of a corporate and the corporate speak, I mean, it is just yap, 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 and it's distortion and disingenuity and so on and so forth. You also got then the lies of omission, because there is no comprehensive, we do get some feedback, but there's no comprehensive feedback of what has happened, what has resulted, what are the outcomes of what government has done. You know, every law, regulation, policy, program, project, what's happened. And it's, you know, it doesn't take anyone with a brain the size of a planet to know that if you don't know where you are, you don't know where you're going, you're flying blind. Well, how on earth can you steer the ship of state to wherever it is you want to get to? But that is the norm in governments. So we have to have feedback. There's a lie also, I think, in the notion of policy, that you can policyize something into existence. There are vast numbers of people involved in producing policies, and policies, and I've done it as well. I mean, in some respect, I understand why people want policies, but what is a policy? I mean, it's words on a piece of paper. You know, here is, well, yes, probably that side. That, yeah, that's what it is. It's useless until it's put into effect, which is why Ray has used the term systems thinking in practice and applied as well. So those are some of the aspects of good government. And I'll just chuck in one other thing. I think I've got a few more minutes before coming to the last thing, which is, how are decisions taken in government? If you look at Westminster, or indeed you look at a local authority, how are decisions taken? Well, they're taken in all sorts of ways. One of the principal ways is arguing. Who comes up with the best argument? Oh, then that's what we're going to do. I mean, you see it on the television, on these ridiculous programs like Today and Question Time and so on, where dualisms are put up, you know, the either or the or. If you don't like this, then you must be in favor of that. And you're being locked into this systematic, as Ray was saying earlier, discussion that, well, this or this, when of course we all know it's a bit like this, and there's all sorts of influences and so on. I mean, it's one of the problems that I have with the culture wars as well. It's just so much of a dualism, and that hides so much. But okay, so we take, you know, you need to be good at arguing. Off you go. Where's the best school of arguing? Well, you go to Oxford University and you take a degree called PPE, which is a bit of politics, a bit of philosophy, and a bit of economics. So you need the politics, The philosophy is handy because it makes you sound a bit statesman-like. And then, of course, you need a sort of bit of economic terminology because it makes you sound as though what you know what you're talking about in economic terms. I call it the Blaggers degree. On top of that, you then get involved in the Oxford Union, which is the best debating society in the world, and you become even better at arguing. And you could watch, I mean, maybe don't, but you could watch the documentary that they did recently on Boris Johnson, and you can see him getting trained up in this way, but of course lots of other people as well. And then you come out of that and then you go into politics and you're very good arguing. Well, I mean, is that the best way of taking decisions? Well, we know it's not. We know that multiple perspectives, how about some real data and evidence and information, and let's talk about it in the round to make sure that we're weighing up this, that, and the other. But there you are. That's how decisions are taken. So I've noticed my slide's gone off, which is perhaps telling me something. The last thing that I wanted to say, though, in relation to all of this, so getting from whichever side it was, the left side, what matters most now to what has to matter most, is the transition. And in many respects, I mean, I don't wish to be glib, but I mean, this is not difficult in terms of what has to matter most. The really difficult thing is the transition. So, for example, Greta Thunberg talking to Polish coal miners. Polish coal miners saying, yeah, we know this is dreadfully dirty industry. We know that we need to shut it. But please don't just chuck us out on the scrap heap, as happened, for example, in the UK in the 80s, and say, bye-bye, that's the end of it. Please help us to transition. How do you transition the elimination of pollution and emissions at the same time as enabling those at the bottom of the economic pile to grow and develop? I mean, do we, as people from the rich world, simply say, well, yeah, we're going to hold ourselves here and you hold yourselves there. You can stay down there. Well, clearly that's not a runner. So how do we work those economics and sharing out? How do we persuade people or indeed persuade ourselves to adopt potentially very different ways of living? I mean, just to sort of emphasize that point, I mean, given how impactful mass advertising is on consumption, how much consumption produces pollution and emissions and degradation, is a viable planet consistent with having mass advertising? I mean, happy to debate that, but I don't see how mass advertising can continue. So there's another aspect of transition. Personally, I'd be very happy without all this advertising, but perhaps a lot of people weren't. So I think I'll stop there, Johnny, if that's okay, and over to anyone that wants to challenge or question either of us, or indeed any of us.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ed. So I've got just a sort of couple of quick questions, and then we'll get into the questions that quite a few people have submitted in the chat. So thank you very much for that. Just to reiterate, as I mentioned at the start, we will come to you to ask you a question. So I'll send you a little invite that will allow you to unmute yourself in turn to ask the question, so you can do them directly. if you would like your question asking on your behalf, I'm happy to do that as well. Just bob me a message requesting that. But that was a really kind of really nice journey into presenting some of the different aspects that you explore in the book. And I thought it'd be nice to sort of bring Ray back in to maybe comment on some of the things that you said, Ed. Obviously, Ray, you've had a very long and prestigious academic career on systems, and you gave us a sense of how that science has kind of evolved and is continuing to do so. But there's a chapter in the book about system thinking isn't hard. And I wondered if you could just help us understand and explore a little bit more how we can all sort of think systematically today in our everyday lives, in politics, in decision making, and what kind of guidance you could offer for advocates and local change makers to try and do that better.
Thank you, Johnny. And I see there are questions there along these lines. It's rather ironic that you should ask me to talk about this chapter, which is the one Ed led on when we were co-writing this. So that's all right. We both have our different ways of grounding this. Lots of people say, well, how do you use systems thinking in practice to make change? And the great trap, of course, in attempting to answer this question is that you fall into what I think is the bigger trap, that you say, if you use systems thinking in practice, this causes A or B to happen. And when you say that, you're falling back into the systematic linear trap of causality, which is the dominant problem. Now, I would say, how do we educate systems thinking practitioners such that they transform who they are? Roughly over 50 years, we've got this sort of rule of thumb that about 30% of our mature age students at the Open University come to our modules and encounter systems thinking and its history and its techniques and tools and concepts and all of those things. And they are absolutely excited because here at last is a language and a way of thinking about the world that fits with how they think, but which many other people don't hold. So it's a great relief to think that there is a language and a set of concepts which affirms people's ways of thinking about the world around them. And I would claim that those are the people who retain a certain amount of their systemic sensibilities, and they haven't given up on thinking that this is actually how the world is best understood and best operates, and they try to hold on to it, but against very difficult competition from the mainstream paradigm. Another third of our students have what we call an aha moment. They study our things and it suddenly clicks that they can take responsibility for thinking about their own thinking and changing the way they think about the world, that it's not set in stone about how we engage with or think about the world. And another 30% often get quite angry. They find our way, the ideas we propose threatens their sense of identity and how they have made their way in the world, and they sometimes reject it or leave or other things of that nature. So I would say our experience at the Open University is an exemplar of how society in general might operate around systems thinking. So my first point about systems thinking is systems thinking would claim that you can only pursue a trajectory from the initial starting conditions that you create. So if you engage in something from your historical way of understanding things, there's a great danger that you'll merely do, as Russ Ackoff says, do the wrong thing righter and continue to do the wrong thing righter. So how you create initial starting conditions for any sort of initiative is absolutely crucial. And the way you create best initial starting conditions is to draw in multiple perspectives, to draw in others who see the situation differently than you. Because it is only then that you begin to engage in processes that shift your understanding or shift your practices or shift your social relations with others such that you can work together in collaborative, transformative action. And Ed, why don't you just take over here and describe the differences between Ed and Dad, which rose from your work, which is manifestation of this, which is in our book.
Yes. So, well, Dad, decide, announce, defend. And you may have noticed that this is by and large the way that all public authorities, governments, and so on and so forth go about things. So, you know, we decide we're the experts, we announce it, and then, of course, the defend, you know, against response, dislike, and all the rest of it from the public can take forever. This happened in Devon, and on one side of the estuary, the Environment Agency just over flood defences ran into the ground. On the other side of the estuary at Shalden, they actually did a proper piece of engagement with a professional facilitator and so on. And they found that actually through that process, the total time taken to get the scheme up and running was much shorter. The actual scheme came in below budget. They accepted the wider perspectives that came up because the experts said, oh, the sea level is going to rise this much. And then someone challenged that who actually knew quite a lot about in the public and knew quite a lot about sea level rise. And they adjusted their forecast to this much. They took onto account surface water flooding, which I hadn't even thought about, and so on and so forth. So that is ED, I'm pleased to say, which is engage, deliberate, decide. And that is, yeah, a much better way of going about things. And you know, this is not difficult, but you have to get out of your mindset, if anyone is in it on this call, I hope not, that there is any things that, well, I mean, it's to a certain extent, it's built around this notion of experts. You know, there are these experts in things that have the answers and so on. Yeah, but yeah, collective engagement. I'll stop.
Just picking up on where Ed left off. I mean, one of the most unhelpful institutions we humans have invented in this area of human endeavour is the project. The project only came into effect in the beginning of the 20th century as a widespread institution, and it takes a form that essentially demands of the user of a project a specification of the outcome before you've even engaged with the learning and other things that is necessary. So in a lot of my work over the last 20 years, we've engaged in what we call systemic inquiry or systemic co-inquiry, which starts with a fundamentally different starting point and underlying emotion. The underlying emotion and starting point is to say, we don't know what to do. Let us learn our way into knowing what we should do. Whereas a project says, we know what is going to happen, or it starts with certainty, and it's a fundamentally different underlying emotion in which you engage collaboratively and inquiry. And those are characteristics of the Ed-Dad distinction that Ed has just given. It's also related to power and command and control. I mean, the linear systematic model in governance and decision-making is a centre-out command and control decision-making, whereas systemic inquiry, Ed models say you're prepared to give up the idea, it's a mistaken notion that you have power. You only have power over achieving a tick box for the Treasury or someone else. It's not about addressing the phenomenon of concern. So the in systemic inquiry or co-inquiry or engagement processes, you're seeing power and control arise as an emergent property, not as a predetermined property before you start. And in systems language and jargon, we call this sometimes managing for emergence. You're managing for emergence rather than managing for an objective or a predetermined outcome.
Fantastic. Thank you both. We are going to go to Paul for a question, if that's all right, Paul. I will send you an invitation to unmute. Okay, I read it on your behalf. That is not a problem at all. So Paul says, is it the case that all of this can be resumed by saying, we basically know the answers, but we don't apply them due to disinformation and government capture by oil and other lobbies and investment groups?
Well, I mean, that's not a bad summary. I mean, we do know what to do, don't we? I mean, this is, you know, unlike many of these complex, wicked problems, you know, what's the answer? What's the answer? Well, I mean, I say we know what to do, but I mean, at the top level, we know we need to stop polluting and emitting. We know we need to stop screwing up the land, screwing up the water. We know we need to clean up our act and clean up the planet. So in that sense, we know what to do. Our argument is that in order to do it, then we have to change the systems of governing. And that that would then mean that corporations are brought back into, well, the real world, frankly. Very few of them as systems operate in the real world. I mean, I just hold this one up because this is a book by Runciman, David Runciman, a political theorist, is very good. If you can't, how we gave the handover, how we gave control of our lives to corporations, states, and AIs. We have to take back control, to use a phrase, and we have to take back that control in two ways. I mean, all of the fantastic things that are being done locally, which I and Ray and others are engaged in as well. I mean, it's immensely important. Things like this Festival of Debate are immensely important, and the things that it triggers at a local level. And at the end of the day, we have to get hold of politics and the political parties. I mean, political parties, I think, have possibly outlived their usefulness, but at present, that is the mechanism through which we operate. And we have to get that interest and understanding and commitment to changing constitutions fundamentally through the process of politics, today's politics.
If I can just build on that, I'd like to pick up on the phrase "we know," and ask the question: how does it? What happens or needs to happen for us to claim that we know? I mean, and there's two things there. That's the act of knowing and the we. How do the we come to exist? And I mean, the people in this particular event, the festival, could be seen as a we, and you've come together in a particular form of conversation, some of it mediated by technology like today, some of it face-to-face, thankfully. And I would say we live in a crisis of we at the moment in the world because we don't come together enough in which we encounter others as legitimate others, able to become knowing citizens together. Unless we know together, there's no we. And you can see this on social media all the time. Because social media allows you to be, to use a pseudonym or to say what you want, to say terrible things. It's not mediated and controlled as we would mediate online learning at the Open University. Then there is no we other than a sense of we that is about identity or in terms of identity politics or identity things. But there's certainly no rational we as we would have said historically. So I think we've got to ask the question, how do we co-constitute that we, and how do we put controls and curbs on technology, social media and other things that generate a greater solidarity across our societies rather than division. And the division is essentially highly destructive.
Thank you once again. We are going to go to Tim, whose question kind of relates to what you've just been talking about. So, Tim, hopefully you have an invitation to unmute and ask your question.
Cool. Yeah, so happy to speak. Yeah, so you both talked a lot about collective action and collective inquiry, and I guess my question is with who? Because obviously which stakeholders, which people, which organizations and so on are involved in this process are obviously going to have a big impact. So I got quite interested in this kind of question during my PhD. I was kind of thinking about this whole thing as a critical systems attack on kind of soft systems thinking around this idea that actually if you do a collective process of inquiry, action research kind of approach with people with stakeholders who already hold power, then you end up just maintaining the status quo. But also if you don't involve people with power, then you don't change anything anyway. I'm just curious about what your thoughts are on actually who we need to involve and how we get them involved and how we get them to change.
Do you want to go first, Ed, or will me?
No, you go first, right? Not unless you want me to.
No, I'm okay. Well, Tim, it's an area where I've done quite a lot of work. I mean, it's a very good question. In recent times, I've come to try and think about this question in terms of the idea of performance and imagining oneself as a dramaturgist or a choreographer, and ask the question, what is it that needs to happen for a good performance to be created? And I mean, a good performance wouldn't be one where the same voices dominated or people dominated others. And we've done quite a bit of this in our own work on systemic co-inquiries and designing processes which enable people to be heard in ways that don't lead to domination, in processes that are designed to get difference maximised, to create gender balance, to create, and so it does have a choreography effect. How do you create a choreography that allows legitimate social learning to emerge and not just a power play which continues the same dominant discourses? So, and I don't think there's any way around that other than to think about site-specific, context-specific designs for social processes. And this is where the growing field of systemic design is, I think, a really important area for consideration. There's more I could say, but I'll pass it on to Ed.
Yeah, I mean, and that, you know, what Ray says is, I mean, is, you know, I've seen it so many times where, yeah, you in effect design out the inequity. But of course, if we're now getting into decision taking at central government level, they could choose to do this, and indeed, very, very occasionally you find they do. But you have to design that into the system of governing at the government level. It's about the dispersal of power. Some of that power dispersal comes through proper devolution. And one of the people on the call here, I think Michael Mulvey, lives near Switzerland, taken some of the referendum that they regularly have on all sorts of issues at the national level and indeed at the canton or local level, the way in which they're run, and the capacity of people to make decisions through those processes. That is in the Constitution. We don't have it in the Constitution here. They have hardwired devolution. Well, they don't have devolution. They started off with the cantons, and then they allowed power to go up to the centre, which I think is a much better way of looking at it. That's in the Constitution. If you're going to spread power, then that's the way. And it's the same with participative processes that work so well in Ireland, for example, on abortion, and we're saying that's in the Constitution. So yeah, it has to go in the Constitution.
Just picking up on that again, I'm here with my friend and colleague Sandro Schlinwein in Brazil, and we've written a paper about the experiences in Brazil and Australia in response to COVID. And one of the interesting things in Australia was that at the very start of the pandemic in Australia, the Prime Minister, under influence of two state premiers, remembering it's a federation, set up what was called a national cabinet, which didn't operate the way that historically the states and federal government had tried to organise its governance arrangements. They actually started off by saying, we don't know what to do, and we will involve key people from government and key expertise in a process of learning our way into what to do. And the Australian citizenry, by and large, was extremely relieved by this because they thought this was the right sort of approach. But it worked well for a period of time. But then after a while, under the ego-driven nature of some of the key politicians and others, it reasserted its old form, where one part of government tried to tell or to use power over others. And if you take the field of systemic family therapy, which has been a field in operation for many years, dealing with the systemic dynamics of dysfunctional families and other things, they have a concept that they use that I think is relevant to this discussion. They talk about creating a problem-determined system. And that is where people who think there is a problem come together and create the system around how they agree the nature of the problem. So the early action in Australia was, in a sense, a formation of a problem-determined system to do something about the pandemic. But the alternative is a system-determined problem. And that is that people in the system constantly define the problem in their terms because they want to defend their interests in the system that exists. And so that's, again, what happened in the Australian context. It flipped back to a system-determined problem. And wherever you have representativeness in bodies, whether they be local committees, branches of governance, stakeholder groups, wherever you have representativeness, then our research evidence shows you never get social learning because people always speak with the voice of the groups they are representing. They are never open to learning and to formulating the problem in the context of the unfolding perspectives of those around the table or in the process.
I noticed there was a point about regulation. I'll just bang this in quickly in the chat. And, you know, strengthen regulation. Yeah, regulation is very, very important. But you've then got the governance of the regulators. If you want to neuter, in effect, a regulator at present as a government, then you don't need particularly to change the laws at all. You can leave the laws. You just cut their budget, cut their budget, cut their budget. So they don't have the money or the power or the time to enforce, for example. And you'll see that around the world. If you're going to fix that, what do you have to do? You have to take the governance of the regulators out of the control of the government. And typically that would mean that you put it into a properly constituted second chamber. If you take the BBC, you know, at present it's become more or less a state broadcaster because the people who are asking the questions know that just round the back of them is a government that in effect is paying them because it will cut the license fee. So, well, I, you know, better not be that pokey in terms of asking my questions. If we're going to have a properly constituted public broadcasting news service, then you need to take that out and of the control of government and stick it into a properly constituted second chamber.
Wonderful. Thank you. Reinhardt, you are our next question.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, okay. I must say that initially I was a bit disappointed by your presentation, but it's not the first disappointment because I feel the presentation lacked the issue of power. And in my analysis, the unacknowledged social purpose of our global human system is the concentration of power in the hands of fewer and fewer human beings. And that is also the way, I mean, how I see why there is an unwillingness to address the issues, because if you want to address it, you would have to disperse power. Now, if I talk about power, I refer to somebody called Pierre Bourdieu, who has written about capital and the exercise of power. As you said, your book is published in France. You may refer to him. So I mean, fortunately, in your discussion, it came up a bit more, but I think power, I'm a medic by background, so I think power is a huge issue and it is highly addictive. It's probably the most addictive drug in the world, but it's not acknowledged. Yeah, and so I think if I analyze the situation, I feel it all is linked to the issue of concentration and of power and the addiction to power. But the problem is, and that's why I listened to your presentation, is what do I do? How do I address it? I mean, I'm a German citizen living in the UK and I have the luck I can vote in the European election, but I don't know what to do. Shall I just ignore it because I feel it's just a farce, or shall I vote for a small party which I think may address it, but is unlikely to win sufficient votes? Or shall I vote for a party which may win sufficient votes and may give some chance of addressing it? It's just one of the dilemmas I'm in, and so are there many more. So I wish these presentations would be more about the issue of power, concentration of power, and what can sort of everyday human beings like myself do about it in order to create or generate a system change. Sorry for my long talk, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Reinhardt. Sorry, the phone's just gone off here, but I guess I might turn the question back on you. I mean, this is often raised in academic discussions about systems and other types of approaches. I mean, and there are methods and methodologies that can engage with it. But Ed, why don't you pick up the question? There's a phone going off here, and you can. I'll mute myself for a minute.
Okay. I agree, Reinhardt. Absolutely, it's about power. you know, we've got money and the power of money versus nature. Of course, I mean, the irony of all of that is that nature, the natural world, the biosphere, is far more powerful than any of these economic systems and any of these traders and all the rest of it. But yeah, some of them think they're going to escape by getting to bunkers. So, you know, sod the rest of you. Some of them think that, well, it would be a jolly good thing if the population went down by, I mean, forecasts at present for 2 degrees warming is 1 billion people will extra will have died by the end of the century. It looks like we're going to be well over 2 degrees, and you know, so estimates of the number dying 3.5 billion, possibly even 6 billion. Some people going, yeah, well, that's the way it goes. That's what the natural world does. You know, population gets out of hand, it controls. So yeah, let's just carry on. But in terms of how we exercise power, well, how do we exercise power? We typically, you know, there's a revolution. I think the population is, in some respects, you know, we're all too fat and happy, aren't we? And so I think the chances of taking up arms in a big in this country, I mean, it's happening in some countries, obviously, but yeah, it's a difficult thing to do anyway. But it is through talking. And, you know, we are talking, I appreciate it's mainly us, Ray and I talking, but I mean, we are talking to each other. We are spreading messages. We are saying, look, what I would say to political parties, if you don't have an agenda for how you're going to change the constitution, then really, okay, at the margin, you know, we're going to get some marginal stuff, aren't we? I mean, you know, you can take a view on the current political circumstances in the UK. I don't think it's difficult. We're going to have a change of government. That's fine. But they're operating at the margin. So demanding and pressurizing and asking politics, you know, how are you going to change the constitution? Because that's the only way out of it. And that's the way we talking and lobbying and all the rest of it. The one thing I would say is that I have noticed in the public discourse more systems thinking terminology appearing. And so the word that has been used today, emergence, you know, creating the conditions for emergence, and then things happen. I've seen and heard a number of people using that. Reframing, you know, let's not look at it that way, but let's look at it this way, and other terms. So it's creeping up. But yeah, I mean, Reinhardt, if you know, it's people say to me, well, what do you think's going to happen? Well, I think we're, you know, heading off down the road of progressive collapse and death is what humans have decided. And, you know, if we decide that we don't want to do that, then, yeah, we have to change our thinking.
So we're out of time, Johnny. Sorry about that interruption, but just one minor, or additional point. I think ultimately the change in power that you speak about has got to be at the level of the individual and in family social dynamics. If you take the phenomenon of domestic violence, which is widespread, and in which there are murders every other day of particularly women by men because of domestic violence, then you have a manifestation of what it is to be human, which is a pathology of power, if you like. And until we can change that pathology, then what it means to be human and how we deal with our relationship with the biosphere is unlikely to change significantly. So the phrase I use and drawing on the work of Umberto Maturana, until we're capable of, as a species, of living what he calls the biology of love, in which the other arises as a legitimate other, then we have got very little viable future, it seems to me. And so we need to work in all of our institutions and practices such that the other arises as legitimate others, and the other can be the biosphere and other species, of course, as well. How the challenge is, how do we put that in practice? How do we put it into curricula? How do we put it into early childcare? How do we put it into the lives of narcissists who rise to the top in our parliamentary systems, etc.?
Thank you very much, both. You are indeed right, Ray. We are fast approaching the 90-minute mark, but I am going to go to Philip, if that's all right, as our partners for this event at Democratic Yorkshire. And hopefully you have an invitation to unmute.
Right, thank you very much for that, Johnny. Well, it's Democratic Yorkshire, which is now Liberating Yorkshire, because couldn't really make a mind up on the title, so we swapped it halfway through. Well, I'd like to start off with a vote of thanks, which is my usual spot at the end of these things. This has been extremely enlightening as far as I'm concerned. I know much more about systems thinking than I did, and I have read the book, but I understand it much better than I did. And I've also talked with Ed about the subject, but I still understand it much more than I did. I also understand much more about the ecological problems that we face, or wicked problem that we face. Now, I'm going to be a little bit naughty, because really I ought to have spoke to Ed and Ray, perhaps yourself, about this beforehand. We've certainly learned a lot about what the wicked problem is today. And we've also learned a great deal about systems thinking. But having read through the questions that have come up, I think there's people are now saying, well, what next? What do we actually do about this? And that is a subject that we're keen to look at Liberating Yorkshire. And I'd encourage all of you, if you haven't already, to look at our website, liberatingyorkshire.co.uk. So my next suggestion is that perhaps, rather than this be the end of this section, it be of this meeting, it be a postponement, that we reconvene, say perhaps September time or something, and start looking deeper at what we can actually do here in Yorkshire. There's been a lot of talk about constitutions, and I'm not surprised, because that's certainly something that Ed and myself have been working on, a people's constitution for Yorkshire. And for years now, or it feels like years, doesn't it, Ed? And we've made some gradual progress. But I think what I'd like us to do is to reconvene and look at what a constitution would look like in Yorkshire from a perspective of systems thinking, but not just systems thinking about the environmental stuff, which we've and ecological stuff we've touched on today, but other important areas such as social inclusion and so on. So, as I said, Ed's looking at me as though I have been very naughty in raising this now, and I have. But that's what the two things I'd like to do. One, I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I'd like to thank Johnny for an excellent way that you've conducted this meeting. And I'd like to thank Ray, who I've only actually spoken to, although we've emailed each other over this last few months, and Ed, who feels like an old friend by now, who's attended lots of these and spoken lots of these things. Reynard is absolutely right. It is about power, but how do we make sure that that power goes to the common man, if you like, the people living in our small communities, in our neighbourhoods, and it is about snatching it back from those that have taken over from the current government, from the systems that we have in government, from the global economics and so on. But by golly, it's an important thing to do. But how on earth are we going to do it? There was a slide where it mentioned transformation. It is about transforming not only Yorkshire, but the whole worldwide system into something much more meaningful. Now, I'm a Yorkshire lad. I'm a Batley-born lad. So my interest is obviously starts here in Yorkshire. But that doesn't mean to say that we should look at other parts of England and certainly look at this globally. But how do we influence that from Yorkshire? And so that's what I'm going to be suggesting over this next few months, that we look again at that. And I think Ed wanted to respond. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Thank you, Johnny.
Well, thank you, Phil. And yeah, huge thanks to Liberating Yorkshire for being a partner on this event. We are just a little bit over time, so thank you to everyone for sticking with us. A huge thank you to both Ray and Ed for their fantastic insights and responses today. It was genuinely interesting. I've dropped a link in the chat to the book. I've dropped a link into the chat for the remaining events that are at the festival this year. So there's only 9 days left of the festival this year officially, but there's still 12 events that you can join in on, and some of those are online, so you can join from wherever you are in the world that you have joined us today. But other than that, there's a link for you to support and donate, and we will sign off there. And I hope, however much of your day you have left, that it's good to you and you enjoy it and get to ponder all the wonderful things that we have learnt about and heard today. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you again soon.